Probably not understand my Italian because it's only slightly better than my Chinese. And Carolinian landscapes in the north is how powerful people and religious institutions managed to control large parts of the countryside and organize the production into a large extent in the context of estates characterized by some form of dependent labor. Of course, this is an image created by written sources of mainly ecclesiastical origin, and it is difficult to establish whether all productive areas in the countryside were organized in the context of villae. The nature of the estate, the form of exactions, and the measure of dependency of the rural workforce differs from region to region. A lot of energy has been spent on the analysis of the development of the classical Carolinian estate, comprising a mansus indominicatus and dependent mansi of different status. One even debates the nature of the mansus. Is it a farmstead where you could walk to, you could visit and inspect its lands, or is it rather an administrative or fiscal unit that you would never recognize in the landscape? Does the estate organize social life, or is it rather the village with its farmsteads, each of which may belong to a different estate and different owner? There will have been complex relations between estate, local group, co-resident group, to name a few organizing principles which were present at the same time. Archaeology can contribute to this debate, first of all by showing what geographical organization of the population was there, how rural dwellers organized their settlements, and by showing on the basis of exchange of material culture what relations existed between different groups. If we combine that with sources, interesting patterns may emerge. I'll show you such an analysis for a region in the southern Netherlands. Region number 1. We try to do in all kinds of regions. Charlemagne is coming from this region. For those who do not know exactly where it is. Aachen is here. Where is the cursor? Aachen is here. And the famous treaty town of Maastricht is here. There's good archaeological evidence in this region number 1, and there's an interesting body of charters from the late 7th and 8th century. And a lot of historical geographical analysis have been carried out there. I must warn you, the amount of evidence is overwhelming, my presentation short and thus very generalizing. You can discuss with me any line I will say from this moment on. First, I will give a sketch of the development of settlements and settlement patterns, then a short overview of written sources, then some insight in the historical geographical analysis, and then a short characterization of the possible nature of the estates in the 7th and 8th centuries. First, the nature of the settlements and settlement patterns. The region I will talk about is the flat, sandy area in northern Belgium and the southern Netherlands. It's a fragmented landscape, split up in cells by numerous small streams. In between, small habitable plateaus are situated on which we find the medieval settlements and arable fields, the grey areas. Originally, these plateaus must have been covered with oak beech forest. After the middle of the 3rd century, the region was almost totally abandoned. A short period of colonization occurred at the end of the 4th and the first half of the 5th century. Again, it was almost completely abandoned. Cemeteries indicate that new colonization processes occurred around the middle and in the second half of the 6th century. The cemeteries are small, and colonization groups must have been limited to 3 or 5 households. A lot of questions can be asked about the social composition of these groups, their region of origin, whether individual families were already related and or developed a new group identity in this region, and whether already in this phase the foundations were laid for a concentration of property visible in the late Merovingian and Carolingian period. We should also ask whether already in this phase the foundations, you read that line already. The related settlements pattern is difficult to establish. Hardly any colonization settlements have been found. We have the impression that no nuclear settlements were involved, but that the colonists lived scattered in the forests on the relatively fertile plateaus. We also hypothesized that they constantly moved the farmsteads, so that individual settlement sites consisted of only a few traces and a few sherds. Such a pattern of wandering settlements would be surprising. It sounds rather prehistoric. Recently, a confirmation for this supposition was found near the town of Breda, where in a large excavation area also traces of early medieval habitation were found. The remains of buildings were not very well preserved, but the lower parts of the wells were. In this region, every farmstead usually has its own well, made of a hollowed out tree trunk. We can often date these dendrochronologically. In Breda, a series of dendrodates is available. If we add a line to these dates, the red lines, indicating a period of use of 30 years, it's a guess, we see that there is a succession indicating a succession of farmsteads probably every 25 to 30 years. It also indicates that only one farmstead is present at a time, although not all wells are dated. At times, two farmsteads may have been present, or the series continues into the 7th century. If we plot this series on the excavation plan, we get the following impression. There we go. Of what is probably a system of one or two wandering farmsteads in the late 5th and 6th century. They seem to move around the wet or moist area, that is the green area. If we create a general graphic model of this settlement system, it might look like this. So the settlements are moving, the red arrows, but they all bury their dead in a single settlement. So if you find one of these circles, then you have only a very, very small part of the settlement system. Although it is a primitive system, you have only a very small part of it. This system changes to a high degree in the middle of the 7th century, when new nucleated settlements begin to dominate the settlement pattern at the local level. The best example found yet is found at a place called Geldrop. Others have been excavated as well. The site is occupied since AD 600. But around the middle of the 7th century, a new settlement is created. A number of farmyards are present, having a house, a well, usually one or more outbuildings, and in 5 cases also burials. The dendrochronological dates of a number of wells also suggest that a new settlement phase in the middle, that there is a new settlement phase in the middle of the 7th century. All in all, it seems that a new settlement is created, consisting of several farmsteads. This is still a guess. It's very difficult to attach individual buildings to individual farmsteads. A new settlement is created consisting of several farmyards around an open space that is defined by the graves. If you connect the graves with a line, you get this. They are probably situated, the graves, at the limits of the farmyard on the one hand and the open space on the other. The individual grave groups may define the individual households. Altogether, they define the open space and thus the co-resident group. And a similar example has been found at a place called Domlum. There's an open space in the center, and if you connect the graves with a line, the blue line, you get this. A number of questions remain unanswered. What is the relation between the previous wandering settlements? Did the old inhabitants start to live in a single stable settlement? It is functioning. The objects in the graves suggest that newcomers were involved as well. So not only people that already lived in the area, but newcomers as well. Both in Domelen and Geldrop, many objects have their best parallels in the Middle Rhine area and southern Germany. I'll show you the examples, or one example or two, from Geldrop. These two graves, belts with multiple fittings, like this one under restoration, of which specimens were found in two men's graves in Geldrop. You see, they come from far. Moreover, in a third grave, a sword was found with best parallels in southern Germany. The ornamentation of the sword belt that went with it finds parallels in the Middle Rhine Valley. If we try again to create a graphic model of this settlement phase, it might look like this, if it appears. A nucleated settlement, the sword belt, sorry. The model might look like this: a nucleated settlement of which the dwellers may bury their dead on the farmyard as well as in other places, maybe the older cemetery, maybe even outside the settlement territory. Maybe an isolated farmstead of the previous period still exists. The layout of the nucleated settlements changes in the course of time. The open space is occupied in the course of the 8th century. This is probably a settlement phase around 700, 725, with much less outbuildings, as you can see. And this is the Carolingian settlement. It gets worse. What is significant is that the Carolingian farmsteads are less complex. Usually only a house and a well remains. Occasionally an outbuilding is present. Moreover, the number of farmyards in these settlements is smaller. This, you have to divide it by 2 or 3, so there remains only, and there's a small part not excavated. So there may be only 2, at the maximum 3 houses at the same time. And the construction of houses also changes. No more burials are present in the settlement. This is Carolingian Renaissance, of course. All these elements indicate that an important transformation in the organization of the economy and social structure of the co-resident group took place in the first half of the 8th century. And finally, from this period on, although it might have started a bit earlier, new isolated farmsteads are created. There should appear an arrow, but such as these found at Geldrop and a place called Weert. They seem to be scattered over the landscape, as excavations in Weert show. This is the advantage of large-scale excavations in the landscape. The red dots are all Carolingian farmsteads. They are not contemporary, they just move around the landscape again. So what we have established is that after the colonization of the region, 2 important transformations in the settlement structure took place. One around the middle of the 7th century and one in the first half of the 8th century, resulting in a new settlement structure around the middle of the 8th century. It is exactly in this period, around 700. Now, read fast. About the estates, that we have a number of charters in which aristocrats donate landed property to Willibrord, the bishop of the Frisians and abbot of Echternach. And they say it's parental property, so they must have got it somewhere in this period of transition. If you map the places where the property is donated, you get this, and the lines between the dots indicate that there's a single owner who is donating these different parts of estates. The aristocrats are probably at home in regions further south. The property they hand over is characterized as follows. Very short lines from the charters. They do not name the property. They have not a single word for the property. They say just it's property that I inherited, and it's in a locus, and there are so many casate, and there's a sala et curticula. Further details are found in a line describing the appurtenances. Neither the short description or the appurtenance lines are standardized, so they might give some idea of reality in this particular place. The property thus seems to consist of a number of agricultural units described as casate. The owner of the property owns a sala cum curticle. This does not seem to be the same as a mansus indominicatus of the Carolingian age. It might not even be a farm, but rather a house and a yard where the owner could reside when he was present. The estate thus seems to consist of a number of loosely structured farmsteads in a locus, the word used to describe the place. It is my guess that the mancipia living on these casate are dependent in some way, but on the other hand are still relatively independent and run their farmsteads mostly on their own. They could say that one could say that the estate and the relations of dependence are activated when the owner or his or her representative is present and expects the dependent farmers to pay tribute to him or her when which they had to produce before, of course. The functioning of the estate may thus depend to a large extent on the presence of the owner. Suppose this owner is not there at the estate for 5, 6, 7 years, and what are they going to do with the surplus they produced for this owner? This seems to change in the 8th century. Now the agricultural unit is the mansus, and from the years around 800, mansi indominicati have appeared in the landscape. These are certainly, to my opinion, large farmsteads, in contrast to the sala et curticle of the late Merovingian period. The mansi indominicati are run on the basis of dependent labor, both present at this mansus as well as labor provided by the occupants of the mansi. The mansi indominicati probably have been reclaimed, initially on the basis of the dependent labor of the occupants of the mansi. This means that a major change took place. In late Merovingian times, their reclamations enlarged their own casate. Now they might enlarge the mansi they occupied, but initially also the mansus indominicatus, on which in the course of time mancipia were housed as well. The mansus indominicatus, being rather a fixed element in the landscape, may thus have been an extremely important element in naturalizing the growing social inequalities in the countryside, in a way the more modest sala et curticle will never have done. But we have to be careful. The mansus indominicatus may have come into existence, for instance, because of choices the peasants made as well. Many of them could have chosen for reclamation work and provide work instead of paying tribute and providing goods or money. Moreover, in a situation of population growth, working on the mansus indominicatus could have been a way of escaping the hardships of too large a household on the farmstead, or an escape of those who were not able to create a farm of their own or had no chance to inherit one. This would mean that in transforming the estates in the course of the 8th and early 9th century, decisions by peasants could be as important as aristocratic force. It could also mean that when no goods but work had to be provided, they were able to bring a small surplus of the mansus they occupied to the market. However, we find never coins in the Carolingian settlements. Finally, it is important to realize that these transformations in the structure of the estate took place in a period, the 8th century, in which an enormous amount of land in the region changed hands from aristocrats to religious institutions, some of them hundreds of kilometers away. Can we have any idea of the geographical structure of these estates? Yes and no. So anyone who is criticizing me on what follows gets the answer no, and anyone who likes it gets the answer yes. The description of the elements of the estates in the early charters is insufficient to reconstruct the estates. We tried to get some insight into their geography by using later evidence, which is a very dangerous endeavor. Moreover, it only provides us with very static images, knowing that estates and settlements were constantly transforming. We get an overall picture, but we do not know when the different elements of the estate were coming together. We used all kinds of evidence: parish structures, indications of landed property in the High and Late Middle Ages, census registers of late medieval and early modern date of many religious institutions, place name evidence, etc., etc. In some parishes, even evidence of property, for instance of the Abbey of Echternach, is present up till the 19th century. From the charters we know that they obtained it early in the 8th century. The property was there for 1100 years. It took historians quite some time to identify all the place names mentioned in the early charters. After that was done, local research could proceed. We also used the pedological situation, supposing that the early estates were focused on the plateaus in between the small rivers. All in all, we can reconstruct the following distributions of estates in a part of the region where most excavations took place. We see property by important abbeys such as Echternach, Saint-Tron and Lorsch. Property of Saint Servatius and Chèvremont may have been present as well. A strange situation then appears. In a number of parishes, no evidence of property by abbeys is present, not in the early Middle Ages, not in the later period. And they all have Saint Peter in chains, Saint Peter in Vincolo, I believe, as patron saint of the church, referring to the west chancel of Cologne Cathedral. And they are all important churches. And later we find indications for property of the bishops of Cologne and Liège there. They are the brown estates on the map. Obviously, we have to suppose that in these parishes no abbeys were given any landed property, or it must have been alienated again at an early state. That is something we cannot see. The most probable explanation is that these estates were originally in the hands of either the king or of the Pippinids, and became royal property later. There are strong indications that in the 10th century, royal property was involved and that the bishops in all probability obtained their property from the king, as usual. Let's focus on one of these, the parish of Bergijk, Mountain Oak, if you translate it. It consists of several villages that obtained their own chapels in the High Middle Ages, after 1000 or after 950. The parish church and two of the chapels are excavated, and they all post-date 950. Which is a very strange thing, of course. The chapels were built near or in exactly those nucleated settlements that were created in the middle of the 7th century. And the good example is Dommelen. This is the parish with the dependent chapels, which are high medieval in date. And we have a look at the map of this settlement. All the houses date from the middle of the 7th century until the 13th century. This is the brown here are 13th century. It continues from the and the chapel is built somewhere in the end of the 11th century. The earliest graves are dated by 4 coins by chance found in one of these older graves. The reason why the chapels were built near these settlements is that they probably function as a local but secondary centers in a larger whole. That larger whole is probably the estate. Up till now, we excavated several of these secondary centers in estates, but we never managed to excavate an estate center. They are not threatened by house building, obviously. We never found a Carolingian church in the region, and we never found a Carolingian cemetery. The dead from the Carolingian period are in places in the landscape we do not know. Not in our settlements. If we try to represent the graphical model of this situation, we get the following image of a composite estate. The estate center is not around the parish church. It's dating, the parish church dates from 950 or younger, and it must be somewhere in the fields north of the present-day village center. The present-day village center is a creation of the 10th century by probably the Bishop of Cologne. If you try to represent a graphic model of this situation, you get the following image of a composite estate, using the image of the settlement structure at the local level showed before and adding a basilica, of which we know they were there from the written evidence, but they have hidden them very well. What can we say about the process of manorialization in the 7th and 8th century in this area? That is less than we hoped for, unless we consider what we think it is on the basis, unless we reconsider what we think it is on the basis of the written record. What we can show is the development of settlement structures in quite some detail. However, it seems impossible to equate the excavated settlements with units in the text such as the locus, the cassata, the sala et curticule, the mansus, the hoba, the mansus indominicatus. What is a settlement such as Geldrop or Domlem? What are the identified farmsteads? What are the isolated farmsteads of the Carolingian period? Manzi? Or is a settlement as Geldrop as a whole with only 2 or 3 Carolingian farmsteads a mansus? First of all, the estates of the late 7th century are not indicated as such by the donors. They indicate what is given as inherited property consisting of cassatae inhabited by Mancipia and their wives and children and a sala et curticula in a locus. This hardly seems an indication of a well-organized estate, although one property comprises 11 such cassatae. At the same time, we observe settlements in which men are buried with swords and exclusive bells with silver, and women with jewelry and gold and silver. This is all found in the graves in Domlem. There are dwellers of farmsteads in ordinary settlements. The lowest ranking households we can identify archaeologically. Could they be equated with the Mancipia in the charters, which are the almost lowest identifiable ranking people in the charters? Are they contemporary? They are contemporary, these persons buried in these graves in the settlements and the Mancipia in the charters. In this early states, Mancipia might not be the poor dependent peasants, but occupants of a cassata who handle swords, spears and axes, and who have long-distance contacts and probably long-distance marriage relations. Or are we tricked by the coincidence of the archaeological record, which provided us 2 times with settlements with farmyard burials in estates that could have taken in a special position because they might have been royal or pepinate property? Maybe we are tricked by the coincidence of the 2 settlements. Another problem is that the settlement structure seems to become less organized in the course of the 8th century. Nucleated settlements become smaller, farmsteads simpler, and farmsteads are dispersed over the landscape again. All this takes place in a period in which the written evidence suggests that the bipartite classical Carolingian estates come into being. I find it difficult to correlate developments in the Carolingian period as represented in the archaeological and in the historical record. This time we could be tricked by the written record, in which only a very limited vocabulary is used to indicate a multitude of forms of estates and dependent labor. The mansus and mansus indominicatus of this region could be something quite different from that in northern France or in the Rhineland. What is surprising is that a number of important monasteries, some of them royal monasteries, are interested in having estates in the region. At first sight, there is nothing interesting in this relatively unfertile sandy area where in the early Middle Ages no monasteries or no central places develop. Grain harvests will have been very small and there is no wine. Perhaps they were interested in the other parts of the landscape, the vast white areas which are suitable for animal husbandry. Perhaps even good for breeding horses. You have to have flat, wet areas like the Pusta and the Camargue in France. To do so, you need vast stretches of flat land. Perhaps the reorganization of settlement in the first half of the 8th century is brought about by religious institutions in order to adapt their newly won property to the needs of animal husbandry or even horse breeding. This would be a break with the agricultural system of the Merovingian period. We have to ask how an estate specializing in animal husbandry is organized differently from one specializing on arable farming. And we have to ask how movements of surpluses, producers and consumers change from the Merovingian to the Carolingian period. We don't know yet. What we do know now is that the archaeological evidence warns us of creating simple models of manorialization for a period in which peasants, aristocrats, religious institutions, local groups, co-resident groups, descent groups, kin groups, religious communities, Christian communities, age groups compete and negotiate in creating rural society in the context of a changing property relations and changing agricultural systems. Okay.
Dalla città alla campagna, con una relazione molto complessa e molto articolata sulla quale pure ci sarà da discutere. Siamo in